When I was very young, I sometimes got to watch satellite TV at a relative's house every few months when family was visiting. Eventually, we found this one channel that talked about video games, and while the shows talked about all sorts of games I hadn't really heard of, I just enjoyed seeing my interest on TV. Now, most of these shows were hosted by Guru Larry, with some co-hosted by Wes, and both of these guys still make YouTube videos, so I'll link their channels below. Anyway, one episode of Guru Larry's Retro Corner talked about a game called Black and White. It was just a 3-minute segment of the game, but I was blown away by the concept. You play as a god, raising a giant pet and building a town as you either go to war or have your enemies surrender due to the sheer glory of your city. Being a kid with no access to the internet for another few years and with no local shop selling these kind of games, it would be close to a decade before I ever got my hands on a copy, with the sequel actually being the one I ended up playing. So today I'm going to indulge my nostalgia and talk about Black and White 2, a game that you can't legally buy anymore. So Black and White 2 is a really unique game and one that still hasn't been matched in what it does. It was released back in 2005 by Lionhead Studios, who are the same folk that made the Fable games. And seriously, Lionhead had an amazing few years before they got bought out, gutted, and eventually shut down.
Oh, I made myself sad.
As far as I'm aware, Black and White 2 never got a digital release, so getting a hold of a copy very quickly ends up in hoping for secondhand shops to have a copy, or piracy. Regardless of how you get your copy though, there's a great forum post to get the thing running, and honestly it was far less hassle than I expected for a game this old. Basically, you have to install the game, apply the official 1.1 and 1.2 patches, and then finally there's a 1.4 fan patch which fixes a lot of bugs and helps get the thing running on modern machines. There's another fan patch that's more of an overhaul, but I'll get back to that later. For now, let's look at some gameplay. So Black and White is a god game, which is one of those genres that doesn't really get that many games, to the extent that most god games are kinda unrelated in most gameplay elements, but just share a general vibe. Basically, Black and White is part city builder, part RTS, and then a mix of physics sandbox and pet simulator. It's also weirdly linear for what it is, but that deserves its own section. The main gameplay loop though has you start in a new land pretty much like any RTS, with a handful of resources and a pretty barren map. You then have to quickly expand your city, build walls and armies, and either take over neighbours by force or by the impressiveness of your city. Once you take over all the towns on the map, you're on to the next stage. Where Black and White really captured me though is the openness. Every single citizen in your town can be picked up, moved around, and even thrown across the map. You can assign citizens to tasks and jobs, or even collect resources and construct buildings yourself. Throughout the campaign, you earn points that can be used to unlock new buildings and abilities, meaning you can build giant temples for yourself, gaining power through the worshipping of your citizens, and then use that power to cast down meteors on your enemies. Or just to water fields to get some crops grown. The pacing of the first few missions is a bit slow for my liking, though I've played this game a few times, so that might be why. Once things open up though, I think the game has a pretty solid gameplay loop with lots of different ways to play the game. That said, there's definitely an air of early 2000s physics are cool vibes in the game. I'm pretty sure running this on a modern machine was partly to blame, but some of the game's tutorials and side quests seem to be more about a tech demo for physics objects rather than actually being for gameplay. Some of the time it didn't really work as intended, with throwing objects in particular feeling kinda weird, though I'm not sure if that's just playing on modern widescreen resolutions. Overall though, I'm shocked at how well this game holds up. The fan patch really does wonders for making the game run on modern machines. There is actually a plot in this game, but it's a really bare bones one. More of an excuse to go through the campaign missions rather than anything that needs spoiler warnings. Basically, at the start of the campaign, your people are attacked by the Aztecs at a pretty cool in-engine sequence. You save a few and lead them on the path to recovery, taking on the Norse and the Japanese lands before finally facing the Aztecs again. Each civilization has its own unique models for all their buildings and units, with you playing as the Greeks in the base game. You can definitely see the art style of Fable shining through throughout the game, and much like in Fable, depending on whether you're good or evil, you'll see that reflected in the gameplay. The buildings in your town and the nature around it will warp to be either good or evil depending on your playstyle. Though functionally all the civilizations are the same, with no unique abilities or anything. Throughout the campaign you'll move through a series of island maps, with each level having its own unique island, with there being 9 in total. Though the first 3 are really tutorials and shorter, with the other 6 being around an hour long each. You can play any level in any style really, but the AI for each level have their own personalities and will pursue very specific playstyles. Their moves are really telegraphed though, since you can hear the thoughts the enemy leaders have.
I must find out what they are doing. Prepare a force to destroy these Greek troops.
Though I guess by the time you're a god, some random chief isn't going to give you too much trouble. Where the story shines though is in the writing. Lionhead as a studio were heavily inspired by that style of humour that England had in the 80s and 90s. It wasn't developed here as much as it was in Fable, mainly because of the RPG genre being friendlier to tons of random side quests versus an RTS type game. But basically, in each land you'll get a few side quests, and these are mostly puzzles with a fair few of them being physics based. The gameplay is usually basic in them, but they tend to have voice characters, running plots, and sing songs.
Our nation is brewing this notion, got violence here on the sand. Will you help me throw it to my brother on the other land?
If you enjoyed the silliness of Fable questing, the sense of humour is definitely carried through here, and it makes for a good distraction while you're waiting for buildings to finish or troops to move across the rather big maps. On top of the questing, throughout the campaign you'll be given tutorials or story beats by an angel and a devil, who are just ridiculous characters who talk lots of nonsense. The voice actors for basically every character in this game do a lot to sell the whole experience, with lots of solid delivery and a pretty wide cast throughout the campaign.
It won't be easy to take this land. These people are true warriors. You should watch out for their ranged weapons.
These guys think they know war? Let's show them how it's done, boss.
We really do have to build a wall to protect us, and quickly.
Up until now, I've ignored what is probably one of the main selling points of the black and white games, and that is your creature. Basically, it's a giant version of an animal that you can train, and the system is pretty in-depth. You can have a creature with lots of free will that will do whatever it wants within the morals that you've taught it, or a creature that just works as an extra pair of hands for you, either waging war, constructing buildings, or just eating your citizens. Throughout the campaign, your creature will grow taller and can gain weight or muscle, as well as starting to look good or evil. The systems aren't infinitely deep, but I did feel awful when I sent my pacifist builder pet into war thinking he'd be able to handle his own, only to watch him get pummeled to death. In a really brutal way. It's also kind of awkward to discipline them since they really do react.
Eating people's fine by me, you see.
If your creature does die though, he'll respawn after a few minutes, so don't worry too much. My one complaint on the creatures though is the design. It's just animal enough that I don't like seeing them hurt, but just humanoid enough that as they grow they look like dudes in fursuits. The wolf is the creature I chose, which I think is actually the worst offender for this. The base game has 4 options, with the 1.4 fan patch unlocking a 5th that was originally in the special edition only. Speaking of complaints, my biggest issue with the game is kinda weirdly simple. Like a lot of Molyneux games, Black and White clearly wanted to be revolutionary, so the entire UI is kinda weird. It works, but it definitely takes some getting used to. And for a game about being an all-powerful god, it doesn't have a level select. So once you complete the campaign, you instantly go back to the first proper level as like a new game plus mode, though you can't ever select a specific level to replay, and there isn't even a sandbox or skirmish mode included. If I had to guess why there's no skirmish mode, the game's AI is good enough, but I feel as if it's very scripted. So once you're out of the campaign missions, it probably doesn't function too well, since within levels it does seem to act in a way as if it's waiting for flags to trigger before it does certain things, which probably doesn't hold up well in particularly open levels. And while I touched on this before, I just wish it was easier to skip the tutorial heavy first few missions. Maybe that's just me, though maybe it's time to finally talk about that other fan patch I mentioned at the start of the video. So Black and White 2 Redux is an overhaul mod for the game. As far as I can tell, it's still getting updates and everything. It does a lot of things like overhauling the campaign map designs, adding new music, and changing a whole bunch of core features like the AI. On top of all that though, it tries to add in a skirmish and sandbox modes. The mod did have to do all this from within the game's existing structures, meaning that the sandbox and skirmish maps aren't easily accessed from simple menus, but instead are physical places where you click on scrolls to teleport you to where you want. Which, funnily enough, is kinda like the menu system in Fable 3. Honestly, I'm impressed with the work on this mod, but I wouldn't recommend it to first time players. The reason is, I think it changes the game too much. Most of the changes are stuff I wanted in the game before I even knew this mod existed, but one or two of the additions, such as changing how building zones work, just didn't sit right with me. So while I could adapt to it, I don't know if I'd have liked this game as much playing it like this from the beginning. All in all though, if you played the game before or finished the original campaign and want more, I would easily recommend this mod. There are other mods for the game, but I didn't want to go too deep into mods for this one video, but decided to shout out this one since, as I said, it touched on a whole bunch of stuff that I felt the game did need. Before we wrap things up, I want to talk about the game's one DLC, Battle of the Gods. So Battle of the Gods adds a handful more lands, as well as a few new features like new army types, more miracles, and honestly looks pretty good for an expansion. The intro cutscene alone is probably the prettiest in the game. The DLC itself wasn't working for me at all until I found a fan patch on the Black and White Discord, and then it worked flawlessly. So yet again, thanks to the community for keeping this game alive. The DLC allows you to import your creature from the main game or choose a new one, then drops you into a new campaign. Maps from the base game do get reused, but this isn't too upsetting since they are repopulated with new quest designs and have slightly changed conditions. The DLC itself is good. By the time you're playing the base game, it's definitely worth a playthrough if you haven't had quite enough of the game. Though with that said, it's definitely going for a more challenging vibe than the base game, which does limit the ability to play basically any mission in any style. The new voice lines are yet again excellent though, making it worth it to play through it just for them. The DLC has you fighting another god instead of just a random chieftain, which is probably the reason the difficulty spikes for the DLC.
This world reeks of life. The sweet of happiness chokes me. Rise, rise, my fleshless eye, rise!
Let's wrap this up. You might be wondering if I like the game, and the answer is yes. I think it's very creative, it's fun, and I'd love to see a sequel of some sort. I've touched on this throughout the video, but it just seems so strange, especially since this is a sequel, for the team to have come so close to a game that for me would have been a real gem, and leave it that bit short with the lack of level select and skirmish, as well as the absence of multiplayer. Since this was a PC exclusive, maybe they knew the modders would eventually step in, since Black and White 1 did actually get a multiplayer mod at a point. But it seems like the tools are lacking enough that modders, while adding lots of value to the game and keeping it alive with patches, still have a hard time bridging the gaps that the devs left. It's hard to be harsh with the devs since after being acquired by Microsoft, 3 years later they would give me Fable 2, which teenage me adored. And once I figure out how the fuck to get that going on PC, I'll review it for sure. Until then though, thanks for watching, and I can't wait to hear the Pokemon mix-ups in the comment section. This video was delayed in large part because I moved to a new place recently. This should help video production in the long run, though in the short run I didn't have internet or heating for a little while, so I was busy getting set up instead of working on scripts. If I don't get a short video out before the end of this month though, I'll see you all in the new year. Thanks so much for watching.